Good morning, everybody. It's good to be back. And today we're going to be talking about one of our favourite subjects, which is AS 3959. And we've been doing a lot of work over the last few years on this. In fact, our work started after the 2019-2020 bushfires. Of course, Amendment number 2 was incorporated into the National Construction Code on the 1st of May 2020. So that had already been put to bed. But after these bushfires, we actually thought, oh, hang on a minute, there's a little bit more that we need to look at. And when I say a little bit more, we had about 100 items that we had to consider after that. We have two subcommittees. The first one is Working Group A, which is the Assessment Subcommittee, and Grahame chairs that one. And then we have Working Group C, which is for construction, and I chair that one. I've been on the Australian Standard Committee for 28 years. And I'm happy to say that I retired last Friday from Shoalhaven City Council, so I'm now living back here in Katoomba, which is nice. We also have a maintenance handbook, and I mentioned that yesterday. Now, this is really, really exciting, and Henry yesterday mentioned a little bit, and she said, I hope I didn't take too much of your thunder. I said, no, you didn't. It's great. And I want to talk about it a little bit today, not too much because we've only got half an hour, but there are two parts of it. The first one is the Practitioner's Handbook. And the Practitioner's Handbook involves all those incorporated in that design process. So it's the designer, it's the builder, it's the certifier, and it's the bushfire consultant. All those people are the practitioners who we want to hit. And the idea of that is that we will produce a plan, and that plan will be signed off by the certifier. And this actually started from a Victorian assessment. They went back and had a look at how the buildings were built to AS 3959. And there were a number of buildings that they looked at and not one complied. So that's why we thought we needed to do something with this. What we have certifiers, and I'm a certifier, I shouldn't admit that, should I? I'm a certifier. But what we do is we actually look at bits and components, and some people are better at it than others, and they have their own little niche on it. But they're not looking at what we need them to look at for AS 3959. This new system will be not only certified at the front end, and that document will become the suite of documents that is approved through the DA and CC process. Different jurisdictions will adopt it differently. But then at the end of the document, at the end of the process, at the end of the build, they go back to that document and they sign it off. And they say, yes, it's right. So if a builder who's part of the system says, I don't want to use this, I want to change it, he's got to look at that document. Because if he changes a window, that could actually have a huge impact on the performance of AS 3959. And that's what's really, really important to us. In Conjola Park, we lost 17 buildings that were AS 3959 constructed. That's a really high number, but we lost them not because of non-compliances so much, but because of other things that were impacting on it. And that brought us to the Homeowners Manual. The Homeowners Manual is not as progressed as the Practitioner's Manual. The Practitioner's Manual, we think the words will be finished within 2 or 3 weeks, and then the document will have to have a little bit more done as far as diagrams. We've gone away from pictures, we're going back to diagrams, because we can say more in a diagram than we can in a picture. Because if a picture's wrong, they say the standard thought that that picture was good. So we're not going to do pictures. With the Homeowners Guide, it looks at how they can have it in perpetuity, how they've got to maintain it in perpetuity. This is the missing link that we need to do. That's why it's so exciting to be on that cutting edge. And one thing that we're putting in that Homeowners document is, my home was built before AS 3959. Is there anything I can do? And boy, there's a lot that you can do. So this is really, really good stuff, and it's part and parcel of what we're doing here. On the 24th and 25th of March 2022, we had our first meeting for the proposed Amendment 3 that we're going to talk about today. There were 12 formal presentations, and the most important were the first two, aren't they, Grahame? Yeah. Well, I had a look at what we did in Conjola, and Grahame had a look at site assessment issues. But you can see that the presenters there's quite a few there that would be familiar to you. Justin provided us some stuff on weather. Simon Croft gave us some introduction to the National Construction Code 2022. And Paul England said, well, have we got the testing right? And then it went back. And of course, Nigel Bell, who was also a Katoomba person, he's the Australian Institute of Architects member, and he's going to be redoing all our diagrams. And he said the diagrams don't work, so we're going to redo all of those. We identified the issues, and then what we did was we put into a spreadsheet with all these issues. Each matter was then considered by the committee. And we put the stuff that we could do into a draft, and that's going to be the stuff that we'll look at today. And then other bits and pieces which some of you are going to go, oh, that didn't make it. Well, it's gone into the handbook, which is really, really important to us. And then we've got additional working groups that we had to thrash out some of the issues that we've gone through. And then we've looked at some matters that were outside the scope, and that's basically the cutting room floor. They didn't make it. So let's have a look at site assessment.
Thanks, Colin. So the site assessment aspects really are just trying to tweak and update some of the things in the site assessment. It's trying to provide a transition where we move away from the current fire behaviour models to a situation where we start to adopt the Australian Fire Danger Rating System models in relation to the process. In doing that, we will move to what is essentially state-based tables, and those state-based tables will sit there rather than as FDI tables, but rather state tables. There's to be some clarification in the narrative and commentary section just about what happens when you plant trees, you know, for gardens, or there are a few scattered trees in a landscape where you've got a grassland, just to clarify the role that trees and gardens may have in relation to it. But the most extensive changes really go into Appendix B. So these are in a number of areas. First of all, there are a number of definitional issues which have been updated and tried to clarify what's meant. It actually has very little impact in terms of how the Appendix B is used, but we do note that many people use Appendix B as a performance-based approach in relation to assessments. There's also some changes to the assessment. So at the moment, there's a disjointed issue between the site assessment for vegetation, which is 140 metres, versus the slopes, which are 100. They'll both be brought into line to be 140 metres. There is also some clarification of what effective slope means and how that operates. And it also will use the Caterburn model as an update to the slope. So the more recent work by CSIRO in relation to the Caterburn model will be used, and that essentially limits slopes to closer to 10 degrees instead of 15 degrees, which is it is at the moment. In terms of Section 2, the Australian Fire Danger Rating System does provide revised models for fire behaviour, and we will be looking at that post this exercise. So this is not part of the current exercise, but it's trying to lead us there. The state-based tables to be DTS without reference to FDI or flame temperature. The New South Wales table will simply adopt PBP 2019 distances, and I've already had a quick chat to Matt about having discussions with the RFS in relation to where that might go. The Queensland table may in fact be revised by the Queensland Government. They're in the process of reviewing their mapping and their design considerations, and to see how that aligns with both planning and building. It may or may not make the time frame. They're not certain about how close that will be. And there will be a separate table for Alpine to deal with both New South Wales and Victoria. So that will be separated out from the state tables. But what it also does, it provides the opportunity to actually introduce possibly a rangelands table where we look at appropriate vegetation types and actually do that as well in relation to those states that want to have or adopt a rangeland model approach. But that's not on the current agenda, but it might be something people comment on. In terms of the update on grasslands, I've just got it there. It just simply says that when assessing vegetation classes for grasslands, isolated or emergent trees or shrubs as described within the vegetation description section of the standard and as shown in the figure can be used for determining typical characteristics and structure of these grasslands. Where the grasslands are managed in a minimal fuel condition, they are regarded as low threat. And so it's just giving some clarification to that. In terms of Appendix B, some of the issues go to the definitions used for understory, overstory and total fuels, and you can see those there. In Clause B2, there's no actual reference to the wind speed directions, which was there in the previous editions of AS 3959, so we're simply reinserting something that got dropped off on the way. In terms of vegetation clarification, there's some links to the figures and to the table. And in terms of effective slope, there's an ambiguity in the standard at the moment that makes it unclear whether or not you actually have to use set slopes or you're allowed to use flexible variable slopes. So what we've done is we've actually provided a pathway to consider that, and people should think about just the wording and how it operates. And I know people are a bit bemused as to why we would do 140 metres when we've got a 100-metre setback, but in fact it's because what happens is when you're doing site assessments greater than 20 degrees, which is where it's limited at the moment and where method B applies, you actually have to go outside of that because of the distances that are involved. So that actually just joins those up. I mentioned about the Caterburn model, which effectively starts to slow rates of spread when we're talking about upslopes, and the reference to the Caterburn paper will be inserted into the standard. There we are.
Grahame said, give me a slide that knows that I'm not doing the next one. So that's this one. So Grahame only had about a dozen things that he had to look at, but in the construction committee we had over 70. And you were very, very busy with what you wanted. We wanted to look at some structural insulated panels. I'll just have a look at some of these. Sarking was an important one. Bells can't be steps. So if I've got a very long building, can I start off at bell 40 and as I go down the building I get to bell 12.5? No, don't do that. Once you've got your bell, that's your bell. Garage doors, we've done a lot. In fact, you would have seen in Amendment 1 and Amendment 2 lots and lots of stuff on windows and doors, and we're still going back and doing more stuff on windows and doors because they are, of course, the most vulnerable components that we have. Gutter and valley leaf guards were in there, and external attachments to buildings. Like, what happens if we put some blinds up? Is that okay? No, it's not. Don't do that. Please don't do that. And of course, the one that everybody loves, and I know Matt Willis really loves this one, and that's our Bell Flame Zone test for elements that are less than 10 metres. We want to get rid of that? No, we're going to keep it. So I just did that just for Matt, just to get him a little bit excited. And condensation. Condensation is a big one, and we've heard about that, and we are setting up a subcommittee. So what went straight to the handbook? And some of these things, these are the things that you probably wanted to see in this edition. Now, can I just say that you are not going to get anything through the Australian standard unless you have evidence. You must have documentary evidence that it's there. And we had a lot of documentary evidence from the 2019-2020 fires, but it wasn't totally conclusive. So we probably need to go back and have another look at the next fire. And I was talking to Tom O'Connell from TasFire just this week, and we're going to set up a committee that can actually get ready to go in and do some ground truthing at the next bushfire. So we want people who know something about buildings, so building surveyors or firefighters, so that they can get in there, hit the ground running, and we can get some really good documentary evidence, and we're going to have it all set up on apps and things like that. So I said retirement, but I think I'm going to be busy when I'm doing that sort of stuff. Building-to-building fires was a real disappointment for me that it didn't get in. For those of you that know the National Construction Code and the 2022 Code, if you have a look at the performance requirements that we have now for walls to boundaries for Class 1 buildings, so dwellings, Class 1 buildings, it's 92.6 kilowatts per metre squared is what you can expect. So we know 92 kilowatts per metre squared, don't we? And if we've built a BAL 12.5 home, that those windows are going to be BAL 12.5, how are they going to survive if we have a building next door that is not AS 3959 compliant? It's all about having the herd immunity. So if everybody's immune to it and everybody's built to AS 3959, we're going to be fine, well, we think, cross our fingers. And if it's not, then we need to look at how these are going to impact. And that classic photo that you can see there was a building-to-building fire. This was ember attack on the building on the left, and of course you can see 4, maybe 5 windows that are boarded up, and that's building-to-building fire. Non-combustible fences, we wanted that in, but that didn't get there. So we're going to work on that. Of course, we've got that in planning for bushfire protection here in New South Wales. So New South Wales, the RFS are doing the right job there. And I do have a list of things for you that I would like you to include. Landscaping, we would like to see that. And if we put something in landscaping, these sorts of things would probably go in section 2, which is Grahame's area, in site assessment and what you can and can't do. Non-combustible retaining walls. People think that retaining walls are not a problem, but we've got lots and lots of evidence where your retaining wall is actually a wick that can go straight to your building. But these are going in the handbook. Storage of materials on allotments. I know if you live next door to Steptoe, you know it's going to hit. And if that catches fire, it's going to catch fire to your building and have an impact on those. Non-combustible pathways around the building, and I know it's kind of like a throwaway line that we've got in planning for bushfire protection. Oh my God, it's so good. We need that. We need that on every single dwelling, a non-combustible pathway. If it goes to the boundary or just 1 metre, just to stop the urge to plant right next to the house. And we saw that one this morning from California and how they lost so many buildings, and it's all because of that very issue that we've got. Gutter and leaf valley guards, we wanted that to be mandatory. Didn't get it. We wanted it to go in there if you had impacts from a forested fire, not so much a grassland, but from a forested fire or anything that's within 10 metres of the overhang. We wanted that to go in there, but we didn't make it, but it's going in the handbook. And of course, maintenance of premises and how that goes. So what went straight to a separate working group? Sarking. We want to know, do we use just the flammability index no greater than 5 or breathable non-combustible sarking or a fire-resisting sarking? So we've set up another working group, and Grahame was lucky to get that one. So he's going to be working on that group. Structural insulated panels, they want to use those in bushfire-prone areas. We said, yeah, that's fine, but we want to have a look at it first. So we're going to go through that. And of course, condensation. Condensation is a huge issue. You know, you're still going to get condensation in these buildings if you're in zone 6, 7 or 8. And we're in that zone here, and we're in that zone down at Sussex Inlet where I live there as well. And you need to be able to address that for 99.9% or 100% of the time. It's this bushfire component that is 1%, and it says you're going to be fine. Well, we're not fine with it, so we're going to have another committee look at that and hopefully come up with a solution for it. Now, determining the BAL. It applies to the whole building. You can't reduce it as you go along. We've made that perfectly clear now in the requirements of 3.1. We still have some shielding, which I'm going to go and have a look at. And then, of course, we have determining the BAL, and Matt, this is Darcy's building. Determining the BAL. We don't let the tail wag the dog. If you have an open deck is not a Class 10A. That's why in the National Construction Code, we look at Class 1 buildings or Class 10A buildings associated with Class 1 building, or decks, because a deck is a 10B. And if it's an open deck, then you can calculate that separately, and we've put that in the standard now. And when you look at decks that are either BAL 40 or BAL flame zone, they're both the same, exactly the same construction, and they're all non-combustible. And that's this one here. This is in Lawson. This is my daughter's place. And it's all metal. The top's metal, and of course, in the building code, we've long gone away from the pitching plate that used to put on the walls and then build it out, because our walls, our masonry veneer walls were not designed to have that extra load, and we were finding that they were breaking away. Shielding. We've updated the diagram. Who would have thought that our diagram was confusing? Yeah, our diagrams are really confusing. But Eldon has done these diagrams. These are draft diagrams that Eldon has done with us and tried to make out that it is that component there and which walls. So we've highlighted the walls that are going to impact it. So I think that this is a better way of going. We've also got a change for flame zone. So no longer can you just get a reduction in flame zone from BAL flame zone to BAL 40. You'll need to have a performance assessment. It has to be based on the flame length. So that's going to be incorporated into that one there. We've got a what not to do. because you love to just say, look, it's not in there, so I'll just go and do it. Don't do that, please, don't do that. So we've reinforced now that if it's not in the standard, then the only way that you can get it in the standard is through the requirements of 5.1, 6.1, 7.1, 8.1 and 9.1, which basically means you have to get tested. Now, a lot of people think that I want to get my system, my particular product into the Australian standard. You won't do that. The Australian standard is written in such a way that it is generic. So we can't talk about fire-grade plasterboard. Oh, sorry, we can talk about fire-grade plasterboard. We can't talk about Hardy's fire check. But we talk about it in generic terms. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So your system can still get in there through this other pathway. Attachments to buildings. We had this almost there, and then 2 weeks ago it was, oh no, we've got to send this back to another committee to have it tested. And I'm hoping that we can get this in there. What I do like about this building, it's got a pathway around it. I like that. But the blind, of course, is the problem that we're going to have in there. And we don't just have blinds, we have other bits and pieces that impact onto our buildings. Storage beneath the buildings. We're now going to put a sign up. And what we settled on was do not store combustible materials in any unenclosed space. You should have seen what we really thought about it. But we settled on these words because we thought that that was nice. If you do store stuff under there, you're going to have an impact onto your building. And we've also given you some other components as well. The unenclosed space, and I've used pine here just to show you, don't do this, because we don't want this at all. But what we have done is we've introduced the E1 timbers back into the unenclosed subfloor spaces. We've got the diagrams in there, and it talks about non-combustible sarking, which I don't really like that much. But I do like the fibre cement and the metal sheeting. To me, from a building surveyor's perspective, and going back and having a look at these fires afterwards, I like what we do in BAL 40, and I think we should do BAL 40 all the way below, and that is lining it with custom orb or something like that beneath it, because the temptation for mum and dad to store stuff there, and I don't think a sign's really going to cut it, but I think that we should look at that. But this is what's going in. And then, of course, we've got this, where we put this insulation in the subfloor area. And the insulation becomes that problem that could create a combustible element. While this particular one could probably deal with a flamethrower and it'd be okay, what happens with the dust and the sawdust and other bits and pieces that come in and get locked in that area? Is it going to be impacted by it? So we're actually addressing that now. And what about this one? How comfortable are we with this? And this is Conjola Park. This is what Grahame and I saw when we went back and did some ground surveys there. So we've got another diagram in there, and that diagram is going to show you how to set that up. And I'm not so sure that it's going to be great. I'd prefer to just enclose all subfloors, but then that's just me. And the committee is about consensus, okay? So it's not just my way or the highway or Graham's way. And sometimes we do feel like the two grumpy old Muppet men, you know, up the back just putting rubbish on all the systems. Gas bottles, we've put gas bottles in now. So your gas bottle has to either be separated by 3 metres, or it has to be in an enclosure, like a three-sided enclosure, masonry on 3 sides, and then a concrete lid with the valve pointed away from your building, preferably onto your neighbour if you don't like them. But. And this is the system that we've got here. This is something similar, and this is in Conjola Park, and this would have a concrete lid on it and moved away, but this particular one is about 5 metres from the building. And one thing that we forgot subfloor access doors, and these are now being put in, and they're going to be put in the floor requirements and also in the door requirements. And of course this one here, this is my one in Katoomba, this one here is metal, and it actually does achieve it. If you use timber, and a lot of them are timber, be very, very careful and make sure you look at the bow. It's not difficult to put a metal one in. And just for you, Matt, the testing materials within 10 metres, and that's still going to be in there. And the requirements for that came about in that they wanted us to provide a BAL flame zone requirement. And I've got to say, we were not, as a committee, we were not happy with BAL flame zone, and a lot of people were very worried about it. And then we said, well, okay, let's have a 10-metre separation, which we think is important for us to give us some form of defendable space. And then we said, we want all those tested. It would be nice, I think, I would really like to say that let's give a throwaway there, and if it's a masonry wall, let's just accept it. Let's just accept masonry walls and a few other bits. So I am coming your way, Matt. Matt is going to get there. And I think that we should be fine. Flame zone roofs, you hated the drawings. So we've changed them. And what we've done is we've put the new drawings, and you'll see that they've just got numbers next to them. And the numbers next to them will then relate to a component. So we've got the tiled one on the left and the steel one on the right. And then here is what it's going to look like with the components next to it. So number one relates to the plywood, and then it goes into quite some detail as to what the plywood what has to happen in that. And then we've got the timber battens, and 3 is the glass wall. And it goes on and on and on to the 16 items or so that you've got there, which is quite good. And I can't go back. Can you go back? And another one? Thank you. Again? Your question?
Is the fascia still timber on the DTS valve roof?
Yes. Yeah, that was the tested system that went through. And we heard this morning from TBA Firefly that they've had another system tested to 1530 Part 8, Part 2. Okay, so that leads us to where we're at. The draft is ready to go. Kylie is just finalising the amendments to it, and that will go out for public exhibition, we think in October, but I've given her an extra month and I've put November in, because we have to have everything done and dusted and finalised by the 1st of May 2014 to get into NCC 2025. So with that, we've come to the end. We'll open it up for questions.
9 seconds to go. 9 seconds.
With 4 seconds to go.
There are questions online as well.
Your eyes are better than mine.
Oh, yeah, mine's okay. Oh, why remove reference to FDI and flame temperature from state tables? So it's a transition. It makes actually no difference that the FDI tables are there when they apply to a state. So what's going to happen is the tables are the same. There's no changes in the numbers, but because we're actually migrating to a different framework so we're talking about, like, if people are aware of the Australian Fire Danger Rating System models and the FBI as opposed to FDI, if we move to that space, it's going to be a different space anyway. So these are just DTS tables. There was never actually any reason to have the FDIs labelled as long as it was clear which table applied to what state. So this is just part of the transition to moving that way.
I might give you the next one, Graham, which is why remove reference to FDI and flame temperature from state tables?
I just did it.
Well, you can do that again.
That's my...
Why didn't it drop off? It should have dropped off. It's another question.
No, people were voting, and so it got up.
Oh, okay.
You know that. So you can do the Y 92.6 kilowatts per metre squared.
Newfangled things. I'll go home now. Reference to 92.6 is in the National Construction Code. It's a performance requirement. So if you have a look at the National Construction Code for Volume 2, you'll see that reference to 92.6 kilowatts per metre squared. Now that should drop off.
Now it should, but it'll take a while. They've got to get to it.
Okay.
So the next one is all metal deck construction envious of that option.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Brian, I've got a question for you. On one of your slides, you was like showing the underfloor, and you had the insulation.
Do you mean the polystyrene stuff?
Yeah, just stick some foil tape on it, should be right then. But
Yeah,
anyway, no, where you've got the insulation on the subfloors, and then you're talking about the brackets and the mesh and things like that. Are you actually specifying what type of mesh, or because the reason being, because I'm from insulation industry and fire protection, there's a product called Netlon, for instance, which is used, and it's plastic.
Yeah.
Is there definition?
Yeah, what it has to achieve is the relevant test, whether it's AS 1530 Part 8 Part 1 or AS 1530 Part 8 Part 2. Nice and easy. If in doubt, go back to those standards. And they're being reviewed as well by FP18.
It's just that it's a person up the back that's had their hand for a while. You guys will get your chance.
I noticed there was some good work done with LPG, gas cylinders. Was there any consideration about residential battery energy storage systems?
Yes, there are. They want that. That's on our. That hit the cutting room floor for this round, but it's certainly on the list. And Richard and Henry have been saying we need to do something on batteries, but we thought that what we will do is we'll do the others first. But batteries is probably the next one that we need to go to. But we need to engage with the Australian Building Codes Board because they're doing work in that space as well. So they said, don't do it yet, wait for it, and then come in and look at bushfires.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Grahame, Duncan, Scott Lawson, BMC. AS 3959 was developed under the intent of stay and defend. How has AS 3959 accepted the new evacuate early issues in terms of how it looks at risk and construction standards?
Yeah, Duncan, it doesn't really change that at all. It assumes that people may still find themselves in a situation where they've got to reside in the building, and as such, it's a shelter-in-place option. So it's while it's life safety, it's also about protecting the building.
Hello. You mentioned alpine assessment, alpine tables. Will those account for slopes greater than 20 degrees downslope? Because I've done some assessments in alpine areas, and that's 90% of the terrain out there. Oh, that's a really good point. That's a good point. The tables are at the moment set at capped at 20, and we just need to make sure that the alpine tables actually deal with vegetation found in the alpine regions. At the moment, because they're an FDI 50 table, we get all these other vegetation types like mallee and mulga and things like that that are all sort of in an alpine area, which of course they're not. And so by separating them out, it actually makes, hopefully, it easier. But we could do the numbers for 30. It's not beyond capability, but it's not something we had thought about. Yeah, it's a good point.
One for you, Grahame. Are you able to share any further detail on Queensland FDI?
No.
That was it? Good. And the next one's for me. Have the updates of AS 3959 captured the provisions of section 752?
Oh no, you answered that one.
Is that a yes? No.
Rod here, just on the LPG bottles, it's interesting that you include changes in 3959 where there's an Australian standard 1596 for LPG installations. So are you trying to take over 1596 or
No.
what's the interface then between the two standards over?
Okay, so it's not taking it over. This is about siting. So it's not about what the plumbing does and all the other sort of things. This is just principally just about ensuring people site the LPG tanks in a location, preferably away from the house. And if it's close to the house, then there's got to be some protection measures.
But that's what 1596 does as well.
All right, well, we'll have a conversation. I don't know if you know much more.
I used to be on the technical.
Yep, we'll talk. And the other point we just do want to make about this is going out for public comment, and so we do need feedback on it. This is not an end of process, this is a beginning. Thanks.